contact with the victim and just make sure they understand, and is there anything else, more of a public service call. But it could end up with, moving that up into one of the other categories because new information could come to light. Well, that might be a good model for us to look at. I'm interested in exploring it further because it could help us with our case assignments and detectives, and maybe the caseload squares itself away once we have a system that allows us more across the board's way of doing case assignments. Right now, I think it's more subjective based on the unit sergeant, and I think what Perf is telling us is we can maybe put our attention there and see if we can make some improvements.
Grace, and then back to Rosemary.
There are 3 cutback scenarios here. One talks about a decrease of 20 positions, another 30, and then 40. How feasible is it that we could see layoffs of police officers?
Again, we're still in discussions with all the department heads on budgets, and we wanted to see if we did have to make cutbacks, what would be the logical areas to do it in and still maintain a good high level of service. And so that was what first recommendations were. But we're not to the point yet where we can say that we're taking any of those cutback recommendations.
But you're not ruling it out?
Again, it's just too premature to talk about specific budget items. One of the reasons why is, you've got hardworking employees in every one of these departments, and if you start talking prematurely about cutbacks, I mean, it's not very good for morale when people are hearing that, gosh, they might be losing positions. So it's best for us to work that through the process. Rosemary.
Okay, so also back to the detectives, I think it said in the report that they're scheduled Monday through Friday, they don't work nights and weekends. Is that likely to change?
That is an area that we would like to talk with the employees about. I think it's probably in the contract, so it would take some negotiation, I think. But one of the Perf recommendations was that we do not have a continuum of coverage in our detective staff, and there are some gaps which allows cases to go cold a little bit. And if we can complete that coverage, I think that's probably a good goal and one of their recommendations.
So I haven't read the whole thing, but does it talk at all about any proposals that would reduce the overtime?
The study didn't deal with overtime per se because it was just a staffing study. Where do we put our people to get the most use out of them, the most results? Our overtime is really low right now. The only discussion that I remember from the report about overtime is if our staffing dropped to a certain level, then the amount of calls for service time would increase in the certain hours of certain days to the point where overtime might be required in some of those hours. But they don't go into an analysis of how much overtime would be. And that would only be if the department shrank considerably. We're not in that position right now. Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk about the importance of this unobligated time that your officers have, maybe some of the activities, kind of go into a little more detail about what that is?
Sure. Right now, we divide, or this study and the ISCP study from 10 or 15 years ago did the same thing. You divide your time in patrol into calls for service time. That's, dispatch calls you up, you go, the officer responds to something that already happened, writes a report, makes an arrest, whatever they do. And that takes up a bunch of your time. That usually takes up most of a patrol officer's time. There's administrative time. That's going to lunch, going to court, do some things like that. That's fairly low. There is what we call officer-initiated time. That's time where the officer makes a traffic stop, makes a field interview, does some follow-up work. The officer has some discretion that he's not answering a call right then, and he or she can turn their attention to something they want to do. And then there's completely unobligated time, which is everything left over. So what the patrol analysis helps us determine is what do those look like, those categories look like today, and as we adjust staff, how do we shrink some and grow some? What we want to do is shrink the calls for service time. Less and less time cops are going to calls for service, and grow the unobligated time. The OI time is looking really good right now, and so is the administrative time. It's very low. With that unobligated time, we want to convert that into community policing time. Okay, so that's the time when people are doing proactive work, where they're taking some data that we've given them that says, here's your hotspot, and they go to those hotspots and they do an analysis, and it's a repeat calls for service environment. It's it's drug dealing at 10th and Elchina that goes on every single day, and just making another arrest doesn't stop the problem. Those sorts of, so now they have time to form partnerships, to work with other agencies, and devise a long-term strategy to fix that problem. So that's what that analysis is telling us, is how to move people around and how to add to certain units to maximize the ability to do those things. And there's a cheap way to do it now, and then there's the really good way to do it, you know, when our numbers come back up.
And have you found in areas, I know that you've done a lot of this in Fairview and working in Bernard, have you found that it is very successful to have officers that are working those beats in those areas and doing the community policing?
Anecdotally, I would say yes. And looking at departments around the country that are doing more of this than we've been able to do, I think the answer is a resounding yes, and we want to be able to do more of it. We do some now, but this report, in phase 2, it's going to expand CAP, it's going to give some new capabilities to SAU, better crime analysis capabilities, more rapid response to crime trends, and a better handoff, if you will, between CAP and the beat managers that we've created, so that we don't have things fall into the cracks, and there's somebody that owns a problem even after it's solved. Then we pass responsibility for that area on to somebody that's got a vested interest in making sure that we don't backslide there. And so, you know, the report kind of lays these things out.
Does this lead to any conclusions about whether we have enough staffing for basic police coverage in our town right now?
I would say we do, but the chief's the chief, so go.
Well, from the standpoint of calls for service, we're in fine shape right now. You know, it's all a moving scale. You know, we gain people, we lose people, calls for service go up, they go down, but right now, we are getting through the calls for service. Okay, what this report is really trying to do is help us figure out a way to decrease the calls for service load, and then with the extra resources that we get, then how to redeploy that to do more community policing, which in turn should drive down repeat calls for service. So in a way, if we're really good at this, we eventually put ourselves out of business, but I don't think that'll happen anytime too soon.
Dr. Fraser, if you were to create a police department in Anchorage, which one of these alternatives would you pick?
The one that made the most sense to us is the one that takes on, over time, an expanded, decentralized community policing role. That is, there are some enhancements that we recommend, but rather than the 40% unobligated time, which is pretty unrealistic. I mean, it's tough to do that with existing resources without a huge influx of resources. But the model that looks at decentralization, creating a full north-south management accountability split, adding the resources to make sure that there's managerial accountability, making sure that the data is there, making sure that there's good training on how officers can better interact with the communities and neighbors that they serve. That's the model that we think is probably the ideal one. And in the concluding section, I think that's the third one that's sort of presented there. That's the one I think that we think is the one that would really serve the people well. But we also fully recognize that that's not doable in the short run. That really is something that the department and the municipality should aspire to probably over the next 3 to 5 years as things get better, as times get better.
I'd like to toss something out. I'll fall on my sword here right now. I gave him the 40% unobligated time, and I shot way too high on that one. But they did the analysis, and I think we see that it would be great if we could ever get there, but I don't know that we will ever get there. But the analysis also shows that what we can do with more like 30 and 35% unobligated time, 30% is quite achievable. 35 would be great. We've got, he's put some things in perspective for me, and I think we'll put that to good use. And I think there's a lot we can do when we get to 30%. And we'll be looking at that first.
Anybody else?
Final questions? Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Fraser. Thank you, Chief.